Hey guys, Billy here again for another class on Fueled by Faith. Hey, I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes, make sure that I've got a good feed going, make sure you guys can hear me and see me okay, and let everybody get logged on. I know that it's kind of short notice, so I can see the comments this time on the left of my screen here, so I definitely want to try and get a little more feedback from you guys this time. So don't hesitate to ask questions or comments, or just let us know that you're there and that you can hear and see everything okay. Again, it's not a perfect world. I am not an IT manager, but hey, we're going to work through this anyway. David Clayton, I see that you just got on, so cool. I can see your comment right there. That's awesome. So anyway, we're doing this remotely again, as you guys know, with everything that's going on in the world. We can't meet in person, so we're going to do this live stream again. I got some really good feedback last week from you guys, and I very much appreciate everybody that liked and shared this and talked about it. I am going to work a little bit more on talking a little slower. Anybody who knows me knows that's a problem that I have, whether I'm in person or in front of the camera. So talking slower is something I need to work on. Also, like I said before, I definitely want to see that you guys are getting this. So feel free to drop some questions in the comment box right there. I do have it pulled up here, and Elena is over here monitoring the feed as well, so hopefully we don't have any issues there. But if you have any comments or any questions or anything, feel free to act just like this would be us in person, and we can go back and forth, and I would really enjoy that. So this class I called Slowing Down. And again, if you're a regular in my Sunday night classes, you've probably seen this before. This is one that I've also used in a Sunday school class that I got to fill in for. So I felt it was appropriate, though, for what we're talking about, with everybody staying home and kind of a little bit different scenario than what we're used to. So I felt like this was an appropriate class. I dug it out. This is actually one of my earlier ones, but we're going to go ahead and go through it. And again, if you guys dig it, let me know. So there is no greater trust than that between a driver and the brakes. I think that's some strong words. I don't know who wrote this originally, but I thought this was a great illustration of not only in our cars, but also in our lives. It says there's no greater trust than that between a driver and the brakes, and I think that can be reworded that there's no greater trust than us and the person controlling the brakes, or God, as you're going to see a little bit. So as we move forward here, our biblical verses for today. Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And that's a very short and sweet verse, but it's also one that I feel like it can't be said any better than that. If you're in a hurry, if you're always hasty, if you're constantly rushing things, then in this verse it says only to poverty, but I think that could be read to say to ruin, or to struggle, or to strife, or nothing good comes out of rushing things, right? And it says the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean worldly abundance. It doesn't necessarily mean money and cars and houses and that kind of thing. But I think it means spiritual abundance. I think it means abundance of life. And as we move forward in these verses, I think you're going to see that's a big part of what slowing down can bring us. The next one is Matthew 11:28. Now, this one I really like, and this is probably one that you've heard 100 times. I'm sure if you spend any time in Sunday school or in church of any kind, you've probably heard this verse, but I thought it was appropriate, and this is Jesus speaking here. And it says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And yes, I know there is a typo right there. It says bumble. That's supposed to be humble. That's my mistake. That's not Jesus' mistake right there, just so you know. But the point of this verse, I think, is pretty straightforward, and it's one that, like I said, we've probably heard a lot of times before. But everybody who is weary and burdened, when you have heavy heart, or when you have stress, or when you have anything on your mind, that it says, bring it to Jesus. He will take it upon him, and his yoke is light. So it's, in other words, it's easy. What he has for us is easy. And I think this is something that we all struggle to do sometimes. I know I do. It's easy to get stressed out and to kind of kind of try to do everything ourselves and put everything on ourselves, and that's us putting that heavy burden. And Jesus says right here in plain letters, give it to Him, let Him have it. And this one I thought was really good. I actually added to this one from what I used in the first time I did this class, because I really wanted to include the beginning part of this verse. So we're talking about slowing down. We're talking about rest, and we're talking about obviously with everybody stuck in the house. Some of you guys are out of work, or some of you not. Like myself, I'm still working. But again, things are a little bit different than they usually are. So here Jesus is talking in Matthew 6:31. It says, "So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them." And I actually included that 31 and 32 from what I originally used, because I originally just started this at 33, but I thought that was a great tie-in to what we've got going on now. It says that don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink or what you're going to wear, for the pagans run after these things. They, people, ungodly people or people that are non-believers, they kind of chase after these worldly things. But in 33 it says, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough troubles of its own." And again, this is Jesus speaking here, and I really, really love this last verse. It says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." And Jesus is saying, He's not saying it's going to be rainbows and butterflies all the time. He's saying there is going to be worries. There are going to be problems. But He says, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. You just take care of today. And don't worry about these other things. He says, you just seek first His kingdom, and all things will be added to you. I think that's really good advice, especially now. And then Mark 6:31. We're talking about slowing down. We're talking about rest. And this is interesting because even Jesus recognizes the need for rest right here in this verse. I mean, he's got all these multitudes of people, and He's healing, He's performing miracles, He's traveling all over the place. And in 31 right here, it says, "Then, because so many people were coming and going, that they did not even have a chance to eat. So He said to them, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest.'" And I think that's excellent. I mean, like we said, it's Jesus. His disciples are following Him. He's performing miracles. He's healing people. He's doing all these things. But He recognizes the need for rest, to go away to a quiet place, to kind of get away from everything. And He calls His disciples to go away with Him and just rest for a while. So I think this is a really good example of, yes, there are things that need to be done. Yes, there's probably more people in this scenario that needed healing or needed a miracle or, that wanted to hear His teaching. But again, He says, come with me and rest. We'll take care of that. We'll take care of that later. So I think that's really good advice for us too. I mean, it's something that I myself have a really hard time with. But this has kind of proven to us that we can slow down. We can do things a little bit different. We can just kind of pull back a little bit and be with our families. And even if you have to work like I do, it's still a little bit different. You try to give the wife a break or do something more with the kids because they're stuck in the house all day. So it's still going to change things a little bit for you. And as important as those things are, we still need to take some time to get some rest and just get away. So if the weather's been beautiful where you are, like it has been here in North Carolina the last couple of days, hopefully you managed to get outside and maybe put in a little wrench time or do a little fishing or do what it is that you enjoy outside. So this also thought was a great this is a great word, and this is not from the Bible. This is actually from a author, Glennis Whitwer. I actually stumbled across her doing some research for this particular lesson, and she's got some really great books on kind of slowing down and just taking a breath, and all of her books are biblical in nature. So I definitely invite you to check her out. But this I thought was a great word. Here's the problem. Hurry never gets me what I really want. I want deeper relationships with God and others, and hurry makes them shallow. I want to think more deeply about the Lord and the world around me, but hurry makes it impossible. I want to do better work, and hurry steals any excellence I hope to have. And I want to serve others well, and hurry causes me to brush over their needs. So in all of these examples, I think are excellent intentions, deeper relationships, thinking more deeply about the Lord. I want to do better work. I want to serve others. All of that is great intention, but also hurry can make all of those impossible. In fact, they can actually add more stress to your life than you would benefit. So these are some great points right here. Now I hope you guys will take to heart that hurry is not the answer. All right, so let's get into our lesson a little bit here. If you don't mind, I'm going to move this just a little bit. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So this is the moment slowing down is no longer an option. And I hope you guys can see this okay on the video. I know we're taking a video of a video, but that's okay. But this car, as you can see, slowing down is no longer an option for this race car. Well, here we go. Up and over it goes. And if you guys were, race fans, the Le Mans racing fans of the 90s, you probably remember this happening quite a bit. They actually had a pretty big episode of these cars blowing over like this due to some aerodynamics and such as that. But the point here is that once things are that far out of control, slowing down is not an option. And in fact, I remember an interview with one of the drivers, I believe it was Mark Webber, who was making the joke that as the car went over backwards and up in the air, you could see the brake lights come on because he's flipped over in the car and he's standing on the brakes thinking that it might slow the car down, but he was obviously no longer in control of the vehicle at that time. And this is where we don't want to be. We don't want to be in a position where slowing down is no longer an option until things are so far out of control that you have no option but to ride out the ensuing crash. So hopefully we don't get that. Little history lesson, since we're talking about brakes tonight. Mechanical drum brakes date back to as far as 1902, invented by French manufacturer Louis Renault. And that is the same Renault that actually still builds cars today. So they've got a pretty deep history, and like I say, that's one of the first mechanical drum brakes in use. Hydraulic actuation, let me move out of this side. Hydraulic actuation was developed in 1918 and adopted widely by 1920. Disc brakes developed due to the increased speed and weight of cars, and the disc drum layout was first used in 1927 Chrysler Imperial. And we're going to see a little bit more about that, but as cars increased in speed, power, and weight, the need for more braking capacity obviously become evident, and we're going to see that in just a little bit. So a little nerd alert for you guys. Let me slide back over here. And again, this is a huge calculation that you probably can't see on your screen anyway. But bottom line is that brake rotor is the heat and conversion management center. So this is actually an energy conversion equation used by engineers and such as that to determine how much energy is being absorbed in a braking application. The bottom line to this, the takeaway, is that as the vehicle increases in weight, the increase in heat in the brake system is obviously, it goes up. But as a vehicle increases in speed, it goes up exponentially. Therefore, the brake power required to stop the vehicle directly proportional to the vehicle's weight. If the weight of the vehicle is doubled, the energy of motion is doubled. The effective vehicle speed is even more serious. If the speed of the vehicle is doubled, the brake system would require 4 times the power to stop the vehicle, which means the brake mechanism must absorb and dissipate 4 times as much heat. So you can see right here in this example that weight plays a big factor, but speed plays an even bigger factor. And that's why I was saying before that as cars became heavier and faster, the need for brake capacity increased. And we'll see this in an example right here. So, 1976 Corvette Coupe, 180 horsepower, 3,500 pounds, cool looking car, didn't really go anywhere, 180 horsepower. Your mom's 2019 Camry V6 though, the same 3,500 pounds with 301 horsepower. So next time you run across your grandma at the grocery store, don't sleep on the V6 Camry. But the illustration here is that cars have gotten much more powerful and much faster than they used to be. So obviously these cars weigh about the same thing, but this Camry would need significantly greater braking capacity than the Corvette would because it can obviously attain much higher speeds and it can get there much quicker. So just thought that was a neat illustration of a car that you would think is a everyday kind of just grocery getter, and what we would consider a sports car, and how they can weigh about the same but have significantly different power outputs. So yeah, just keep that in mind as we move along this, that the ability of a car to increase its speed is more important than how heavy it is. That's a little phone going off in the background. So when we're talking about automotive braking, we're usually talking about two types of brake systems, and that's disc brakes and drum brakes. Now, disc brakes you guys are probably familiar with the front of cars, even though nowadays modern cars usually use them on the rear also, but they're typically on the front of most cars built after 70-ish or 71, somewhere around in that era. And then drum brakes are usually typically on the rear, and they still use these a lot in trucks, and they use them on the rear axles of trucks, or even on big, over-the-road tractors. They still use some form of drum brakes because they do a fine job in that application because they're big and heavy, and they don't need to be light like they do in modern cars. But in each of these, the main thing that we're trying to do is dissipate heat. That is the bottom line with any brake system, is that we're converting kinetic energy into heat energy. And in the disc brake setup, hopefully you guys can see it on there, we've got a brake caliper, we've got a brake disc, and we've got the pads that are inside the caliper actually touching the disc. And we're going to see in just a second about the way that this caliper works, but the bottom line is that the rotor is actually the heat sink. That is actually the friction surface along with the pad, and that's actually what is creating the stopping force. In the drum, we still have a friction lining. It's on the outside, and we have a drum that actually goes over this. I'm sure you guys have probably seen that before. And the drum is usually heavy cast iron or steel, and it is actually the heat sink. It's the part, that actually absorbs the heat as the friction surface rides against it. So they're usually laid out, drum in the front and disc in the rear. And that's because the vast majority of your braking is done on the front. I'm sure you guys noticed that if you going down the road in your car and you hit the brakes, it tends to nose forward because weight transfers first to the front. And so they need more braking power in the front than in the rear typically. Now, again, this is the typical layout. Most modern cars are now drum brake or disc brakes all the way around. They usually have disc brakes in the back and the front. They're typically, smaller in the back, but still a disc brake setup. They use hydraulic power. Now, I know that this is a little bit hard to see on the screen here, so I'm going to try and move out of the way to see if that will clear up just a little bit. I don't know if it is or not, but hopefully you guys can read that. The power to press the braking material against the drum or rotor is generated in the vehicle's master cylinder. This system uses hydraulic fluid to transfer this force throughout the system into the wheels. Modern braking systems are generally split diagonally as a safety precaution in the event of a pressure loss in one area of the system. With that being said, I want to back up. So as I was saying, they're typically laid out with discs in the front and drums in the back. And when I say split diagonally, that usually means that this corner and this corner are on the same line, and this corner and this corner are on the same line. And the reason being is because if you were to lose fluid pressure, if you had a hole in this line, or if this caliper piston blew out, or if you for some reason lost pressure, you don't lose pressure in the entire system. You would just lose pressure in these two, and so you'd still be able to bring the car to a stop with one front and one rear. Now it would be a little bit sketchy, but you'd be able to do it. Now in the old days they weren't split like that, so if you had a hole in one line, you lost pressure to all of them. And yeah, that's a bad situation no matter how you slice it. So like we were saying, it uses hydraulic pressure, and I hope you can see this. But what we've got here is an illustration of a master cylinder, and you can see here we've got a reservoir with fluid in it, and we've got a piston. That's actually a piston that is moving when you put your foot on the brake pedal, and it's pushing fluid into another chamber in the caliper behind a larger piston. And that is actually squeezing that friction material, the brake pad material, against the brake rotor, and that's creating heat, which is absorbing, into the rotor and causing the car to stop. Now, like I said, we've got a smaller piston into a larger piston, and this is Pascal's Law. This is actually the law that brakes are built upon, well, hydraulic brakes anyway. And the bottom line to this is, again, this is another kind of physics principle that we might have to go back to high school physics class to to really go in depth about. But the bottom line of this is that we can take a very small piston with a hydraulic fluid between them and push this with a smaller force and create a larger force here. So in other words, 1 pound of force a long way in the small piston will raise a 100-pound force or 100-pound weight a very short distance on the other side. That's why you always see master cylinders typically got a very small chamber, small bore size, and brake calipers usually have large bore size or multiple bores. You might see like a 4 or 6 piston caliper. And the reason, because the difference between this can be thought of as kind of like gear ratios. It's kind of like a gearing situation where we could push this a little bit and get a lot of force out of this side, even though you have to push this further to make that move just a little bit. So again, that's kind of how hydraulic brake systems work. That's why we can put so much pressure in a caliper, just putting a little bit of pressure at the master cylinder. And to help us out with that, we use power brake boosters. Now, I know that there's a lot of cars built that didn't have power brakes, and most of those are probably, I don't know, they've probably been converted by now, or at least I hope they have, because if you've ever driven a car without power brakes, it's not a good time, especially in the rain. But most have power brakes on just about everything nowadays. Now, they still do that in one of two ways. Trucks and things of that nature usually use a hydraulic power brake booster, and then most modern cars use some sort of vacuum brake booster. Although there are exceptions to this, there are some cars using hydraulic brake boosters or electric brake boosters as we get further into hybrids and that kind of thing, and they're using variable valve lift technology that doesn't make enough vacuum, so they have to add vacuum pumps or some sort of other type of boosting device. But bottom line, what all of these are doing, they're achieving the same thing. They're actually multiplying the force from your foot to that master cylinder. And the way that they're doing that, again, this is another extremely complex diagram, but we'll try to get the gist of it anyway. Hopefully you guys will get to come visit one day after all this is over, and you can see this live in person and be able to kind of maybe get a little bit more understanding. Or you could download the handout materials that I link in the video as well, so you can go over these a little bit closer if you'd like to. But, yeah, sorry, the little technical thing. Just making sure the comments are still live. Hey, somebody say something, let me know, make sure that the comments are still working. Thanks. But anyway, we're talking about vacuum brake boosters primarily. That's most of the time what you're going to see. And the way they work is it's just really multiplying the force, because your pedal is right here and you're going to push that in, and we've got vacuum on the other side of this, engine vacuum. And we can actually use that vacuum to pull a diaphragm with a large force, because this cylinder is actually much larger than the little cylinder right here at your foot, or even much larger than the one in the brake boost or in the brake master cylinder. So we're able to use the advantage of this large cylinder with vacuum applied to it, which creates a large amount of force. So when we push it, that vacuum actually pulls that diaphragm into the brake master cylinder and actually makes it easier for us to push with our pedal. But bottom line is, it makes it easier for us to apply a lot of force instead of having to use our foot. Like I said, if you've ever driven a car with no power brakes, you know what it's like. You can pull up on the steering wheel and stand on them real hard, and this makes that a lot easier. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you do have a car that does have a power brake system, and for some reason your pedal is really, really hard all the time, even when the engine's running, you may want to check out the vacuum line going to it. You see these a lot. They'll leak, they'll break, crack, and whatnot, and they not only can make the car run bad, but you can also lose braking power as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. We talk about brake fluid. Now, we talked about this being a hydraulic system, and so that means we need a fluid of some kind. David, I see your comment came through, so cool. Thank you for that. Now we're going to talk about brake fluid for just a second, and I'm going to try and talk a little slower. But there are three main types of brake fluid: DOT3, DOT4, and DOT5. And DOT, DOT, Department of Transportation, it's just a certification that fluid needs to have in order to be considered a brake fluid, or to be safe to be used as a brake fluid. And we'll talk about why right now. DOT3 and DOT4 are glycol-based, and DOT5 is silicon-based. The main difference is that DOT3 and DOT4 absorb water, while DOT5 doesn't. And one of the important characteristics of brake fluid is its boiling point. Hydraulic systems rely on an incompressible fluid to transmit force. Liquids are generally incompressible, while gases are not. If the brake fluid boils, it will lose most of its ability to transmit force. This may partially or completely disable the brakes. To make matters worse, the only time you are likely to boil your brake fluid is during a period of prolonged braking, such as a drive down a mountain or performance driving on a track. and certainly not the best time for brake failure. Now, what are we talking about there when we talk about absorbed moisture? The problem that brake fluid has is it's hygroscopic. It actually can absorb moisture out of the air. And the reason that's bad, you might think, well, so what? Let it absorb moisture, right? Well, the problem with that is it lowers its boiling point. And as we talked about just a minute ago, brakes are nothing more than a heat sink, converting kinetic energy into heat energy. And obviously, the more heat we can dissipate out of the brake system, the more efficiently they'll work. And if you boil the brake fluid, you've now introduced a gas. Well, gases are compressible, and that's the problem. You push the pedal, and the gas compresses, but it doesn't push the piston on the caliper. And the reason that the .2, 3, 4, and 5 rating are important is because that is actually a rating of the boiling point, or at least one of the characteristics of them, is the boiling point. And you can see right here, .2, 374 degrees, wet boiling point 284, .4, 446 and 311, and .5, silicone fluid 500 degrees and 356, wet boiling point. Now, you might think, well, 374 degrees, that's fine, I can live with that. You can exceed that in a brake system very, very quickly. And so that's why it's very important to keep, whatever the manufacturer spec is, or if you're restoring or building a performance car, to use, the best materials possible. One thing to keep in mind though, .4 and .3 and 4 can be mixed. You can use that in the same system. .5 you cannot. That is a silicon based fluid. And so if you go to .5, that's going to mean, new lines, new master cylinder, new wheel cylinders, new calipers. That's going to be the whole thing to convert to a .5 system. And if your car came from the factory with .5, like most modern cars, it's very important to remember to keep that in there because those two do not mix. And if you are buying brake fluid, buy it in very, very small quantities. Buy it in the very small bottles, the smallest one you think you're going to need. Because you don't want to open it up, put some in the car, and then leave that on the shelf, for 3, 6, 8, 12 months, whatever it is. Because once you open it and atmosphere is allowed into it, then it starts to absorb moisture, and then you run into the same problem that you've gotten to start with. Here's a little chart, actually, that I thought was a great illustration of this. So the effects of water contamination on a boiling point of .3 brake fluid. So this is the average car, .3, glycol-based fluid. And you can see over there on that side, brake fluid boiling point in degrees. So we got 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. So you can see that's around 400 degrees. After 1 year, you can see it's dropped to about 300. 18 months, 2 years, and 3 years, it has almost cut its boiling point in half. It's actually just a little over 200 degrees right here. So that's after 3 years. Now, who here has changed their brake fluid in the last 3 years? Yeah, I didn't think so. Probably not very many of you. But it's actually something that's very important. If you go out to your car right now, if it's more than a few years old, you probably open the reservoir on it and it's going to be black, or it's going to smell really bad, or whatever the case is. And 9 times out of 10, that's water contamination just from the atmosphere. And then you add heat on top of that. You using the $1.99 brake fluid that you can find, Dollar General, it's not helping the situation any. So you want to make sure you use good quality brake fluid, and you don't want to use it after the container's been opened if you can help it at all. Now let's talk about friction materials. Disc type pads and drum type shoes. So if you hear somebody say pads or shoes, this is generally what they're talking about. This is what you see on most modern cars, in the front, especially most cars from the front and rear nowadays. And then drums you still see on trucks and that sort of thing, but they're still just as effective. They serve their purpose just fine. I'm talking about the materials that they're made out of. Let me see if I got any comments coming through here. All right, looks like that's doing good. All right, so hopefully you guys can read this. Again, I'm not sure exactly how much of this you can see. I hope it comes through okay. But there are 3 main types of brake pad material. When we talk about material, we're talking about the actual compound, the actual physical compound that the friction material is made from. We got organic, or NaO, and what that stands for is non-asbestos organic. Yes, brake pads used to be mostly asbestos, but they've done away with that. So the lowest end of the spectrum, we've got NaO pads. These are going to be the pads that, you go to the parts store and you ask them for the cheapest thing they got on the shelf, and they give you some $12 pads. There's nothing more than really compressed cardboard. This is kind of what you're talking about here. It's just the lowest of the low. The pros of those, though, are they're cost effective, in other words, cheap. They're quiet, they're quieter than metallics, and they generate low amounts of dust. There's not a whole lot of dust. The downside, however, is there's limited thermal range. In other words, they can get overheated extremely quickly. They wear extremely quickly, compared to the other types of compounds, and they have a higher tendency to fade. The problem with brake fade, like we talked about with boiling the brake fluid, which can also contribute to brake fade, with pads that are substandard or in some ways made out of substandard materials, you can actually get a buildup of gas between the pad and the rotor. As the pad material heats up, it actually kind of turns into a gas, and you can get that caught between the pad material and the rotor, and actually it's no longer touching. And if it's no longer touching the rotor, it's no longer creating friction, and it's no longer slowing the car down. So if anybody that's ever been driving down the mountains, and you drag the brakes a long ways, and you notice that you get to the bottom of the mountain and your brake pedal feels real soft and real spongy, you can have a brake fade situation or a boiling brake fluid situation, but either way, you are no longer stopping that vehicle very effectively. So with semi-metallics, which is the next stage you're usually going to find, they are excellent. They have excellent performance. They transfer heat well. They have good bite. They have a high thermal range. They can work in a high range of temperatures, and they're very resistant to brake fade. I mean, that all sounds good, right? You're thinking, well, why wouldn't I just buy those? Well, they're always the price to pay. There's high rotor wear. They actually can wear faster, or they can actually wear the rotor faster than the pad in some cases of extremely aggressive metallic pads. They actually eat into the rotor. They're noisier. I'm sure you guys have heard that before you get in the car, and they kind of just squeak. And they produce high amounts of dust, so you get that brake dust all over your wheels and all over the car, and it's just brake dust everywhere. So this is usually what you're going to see in performance applications, race cars, that type of thing, really high performance road cars. And the reason being is because of thermal efficiency, because they can actually move heat very, very well. And because they're metallic, that's the reason that they can do that. Again, more resistant to fade because they're metallic. They actually have metal in them. And metal is very, very hard to turn into a gas, so they're much less likely to actually fade. Then we've got ceramics. David, I see you do it with 80,000 pounds. Yeah, I hear you, man. That's a whole nother ball game, man. I see Lynn is on too. Lynn, we're going to start talking about battery drain on a 65 Mustang. Well, there's only like 4 things on a 65 Mustang, right? So it should be pretty easy to isolate a battery drain. But we're going to talk about ceramics right here. Hopefully you guys can see that. This is probably what you're going to find on most road cars nowadays, especially anything made after about 2011 or higher, or probably even before then. But this is what we're really kind of going to. They're a little better for the environment. They don't have the asbestos in them like the old organics used to. The semi-metallics, they've got some metals in them, heavy metals that are not really good for the environment, so they're trying to get rid of those. So with the ceramic, they've kind of the best of both worlds. As the name implies, it's actually a synthetic ceramic material, and they're very, very quiet. They're much quieter than the semi-metallics. They make very little dust, and they have a very long wear life. In other words, they don't wear out very fast at all. The cons to that, though, they are the most expensive, as you might imagine. They don't bite well when they're cold, and they don't absorb heat as well as the metallics do. Again, like I was saying, because there's actually metal in the pad material, that metal can be all kinds of different metals, but it actually transfers heat really fast, and that's what we want to do. We want to get that heat transferred into the rotor and out of the rotor extremely fast, because the rotor is actually what's going to cool itself. You see it's got fins or holes or vents in them sometimes. So we're going to actually try to get that rotor to absorb that heat. And the ceramics don't do that as well as the metallics do. Now, they're worlds better than the old organics. But again, in a performance application, if you're talking about a track car or something like that, it's probably not what you're going to go with. But grandma's grocery getter, your work truck, whatever, your daily driver, that's going to be fine. It's not going to produce a lot of dust. And I think that's probably going to be the way to go. So keep this in mind when you go to the parts store. You go to somewhere like O'Reilly or something like that, and they give you 3 options. They'll probably give you a good, better, best option. Avoid the organics unless you absolutely, just organics are better than nothing. So go that route if you can. But keep in mind the ceramic and semi-metallic options, depending on what you're doing with the car. Like I said, if you're towing a big heavy boat, or you got you got a performance car to use it on the track, the semi-metallics would probably be the way to go. If you're just putting it on your wife's car and she's just going to work and take the kids to school and that kind of stuff, the ceramics are the way to go. They're going to last a long time. They're going to be quiet. They're not going to make a lot of dust. So just keep that in mind. I hope that helps somebody. So let's talk about rotors while we're on the subject. Let me get out of the way here so we can get the camera adjusted here. So the rotor's purpose is actually to provide a friction service for the brake pad material. They are the physical connection to the wheel assembly to slow the vehicle. So that's actually the only thing actually slowing the car down when you hit the brakes. This is the physical connection between that and the wheels. And they transfer heat away from the pad and caliper assembly and allow airflow around and through it. Generally constructed from iron, though carbon and specialized alloys are used in specific applications. They do have some supercars out there with carbon discs and ceramic discs and things of that nature. But for our purposes, they're typically some form of iron. And rotor diameter and mass extremely important to a rotor's ability to absorb and transfer heat. And this is a big one. So again, when we're talking about the good, better, best on the brake pad materials, the organics for $12 versus the ceramics for $40, that kind of thing. This is where it can also get you in trouble, because I'm sure that if you did some shopping around, you could probably find some very, very cheap rotors for your car, and you could probably find some that are very, very expensive. In almost all cases, the expensive ones will be heavier. They'll actually be thicker. They'll be thicker physically. They'll be made out of a denser alloy. And they'll probably have some sort of engineered cooling fins and that type of thing in them. And the reason that's important is because a rotor's ability to absorb heat is solely dependent on its density. It's actually how thick and how big it physically is. So you notice on race cars or sports cars, they're really, really big in diameter. Especially on heavy cars, heavy trucks, those type of things. You see that rotor get really, really big and really, really thick. And the reason being is because it can absorb more heat. You get the cheap ones, they're going to be real thin, and you can actually tell the difference. You can actually pick up a 11-inch cheap rotor and an 11-inch, quality rotor, and they're actually going to weigh different. And so you want to keep that in mind. Like I said, this is not an area where you kind of want to go the cheaper is best route. And then you can see in the picture here, I've got some drilled and slotted pictures. This typically you don't see on factory cars, although some high-end sports cars you do see that on. But they're doing what we were talking about. They're actually trying to absorb heat and get it out of there as quick as possible, and actually allow a place for those gases that build up between the pad and the rotor itself, actually allowing a place for them to escape. So we were talking about brake fade earlier, where the gas builds up between the two. These drilled and slotted rotors are actually allowing a place for that gas to escape so that the pad always has contact. But again, that's something to keep in mind, that the physical size and thickness and density, density is the key word there, because you can have a rotor that's the same size and not weigh the same thing. That's the key to a good rotor. So keep that in mind next time you go shopping for brakes. So now, moving on to the calipers. Calipers are relatively simple in their design, but they can be extremely complex in the way that they're made. Brake caliper is the hydraulic/mechanical link from the brake pressure created by the master cylinder to the friction pads. It is designed to not only provide enough clamping force to slow the vehicle, but also aids in dissipating heat away from the braking system. Brake calipers can be single piston or multiple pistons, ranging from 4, 5, or 6 per caliper. Multiple pistons provide increased pressure against the brake pads, as well as ensuring equal loading across the entire surface. So in this example, we've got a single piston. This is your typical kind of GM setup right here. One big piston. We've got a spot for the line to come in the back. We've got a bleeder screw. We've got the pins, and it works exactly like you would think it worked. When you hit the brake, hydraulic pressure actually goes behind this piston and squeezes the pad against the rotor. In this nice pretty wheelwood setup we've got here, there's 6 pistons, and you can see that they're smaller, but there's more of them. What we're looking for is surface area. So the difference between the surface area of the master cylinder bore and the difference between the surface area of the amount of one piston or the addition of all the pistons is what we're looking for. And the difference there is what gives us our increase in power. And again, not just more clamping force, but also making it even across the entire brake pad. You can see here that most calipers have some sort of slider or pin that usually need to be greased, but most people, sadly I've seen that neglected a lot too. And what you can end up with is uneven loading. So when you push the brakes and the piston actually moves against the friction material, it can actually unload one side or the other, and you end up with a caliper brake pad that is touching more on the top or more on the bottom or more like this or more like that. So you can actually get this uneven pressure across the friction surface. And again, like we were talking about, the less surface you have touching the rotor, then the less braking force you have. So in these 4, 5, and 6 piston examples, it just allows a lot more evenly distributed force across the back of that pad. So it aids in that. Not only that, but that nice, pretty machine block of aluminum does a much better job of getting heat away from everything than these old cast iron units do. And getting heat away from that means getting heat out of the fluid and getting heat out of the pads and getting heat out of the rotor. And so again, it's mostly all about heat management. So that's why this rotor might cost $40 and that rotor might cost $400. But it's a get what you pay for type situation with brakes, unfortunately. Does anybody have any questions right now? Again, I've been trying to talk a little bit slower, and hopefully you guys are getting this. If not, again, I invite you to download our handout materials. But if anybody has any questions, even if you're watching this later on, you can drop them in the comment section or shoot me a message, and we'll try and get them answered for you. But I do want to try to make this as interactive as possible. And the last slide I have here, I know this is going to be very difficult for you guys to see because it was difficult to make it where you could see it when we were doing these classes in person. But there are 6 most common brake conditions, and I just thought I'd like to throw this out there. Again, this is another slide that is available in our download handout materials. So if you want to get this chart, be sure and do that and look at it a little bit closer. Hopefully, though, you can see just this part. I know there's a lot of information on here, but what we're seeing here in condition 1 is normal wear. They're low, but they're low evenly. The left and right, inside and outside pad, they're all wearing nice and evenly. On condition 2, we see that the outboard pads are worn more than the inside. And this is actually a fairly common condition where one side of the rotor will have more wear than the other. And again, this is what we're talking about with those slides. The slides that people most often neglect to lube or clean. They get water, dirt, and dust, and of course they're subject to a bunch of heat, and road salt, and all of that. So what happens is that it won't slide properly, and you end up in a situation where one side of the caliper is grabbing more than the other. Same thing with this one. If the inside happens to be worn more than the outside, and again, it's that pin bushing where it gets rust and stuff like that on it. Tapered pad wear, like we were talking about, the pad can actually be pressed more on one side than the other, and you end up with tapered wear. Again, wore out bushings, wore out slides, that type of thing. And then we can get cracked or chipped pads. And I've actually seen this quite a bit in the shop. You actually get a scenario where the caliper is holding pressure on the pad all the time, and that creates an excessive amount of heat and crystallizes the pad material. I've actually seen it where it looks almost like charcoal because it gets so hot it actually starts to crystallize and will actually chip and crack off because this piston right here will get dirt, dust, or dirt, rust, all kinds of other stuff in it, and it doesn't allow it to return properly. And when that happens, you usually get it riding on the rotor all the time, creating excessive heat. And then condition 6 is typically worn on one side of the car, like say the left side, and not the right. And again, we're back to the piston. If the piston on one side, you hit the brakes and it comes out but doesn't return, then you're going to have that one side constantly working, and vice versa if you hit the brakes and the piston on one side never moves. Again, if that rust and crust and all of that stuff is preventing it from actually pushing against the pad, then you're going to get in a situation where the other side is working overtime and this side is doing nothing, and you end up with a situation where one side of the car is worn and the other side isn't. All of these are pretty typical, actually. I mean, most of the time they wear in one of these 5 ways. But again, just make sure that you keep in mind if you're doing the brakes at your house and you're doing them yourself, make sure you clean and lube the slide pins. Make sure you pull them out. You hit them with a wire wheel or something like that. I like to use anti-seize, copper anti-seize especially, but they make special brake greases and things that are just for that. And same thing with the pistons. When you're pushing the pistons back, make sure you try not to damage that boot. It keeps the road grime and the water and the moisture and the salt and everything else out from behind that piston, and you can avoid this type of situation. And use quality pads, to avoid crystallizing and whatnot too. So that's all I've got for now. I'm going to hang out for a few minutes to see if you guys got any questions or comments, concerns such as that. Let me know if everything is coming through. I see, David, you said that you can still hear me loud and clear. So cool, I'm glad about that. But yeah, this is your guys' time. So if you have any questions or anything like that, let me know. And if not, then we'll pray for you. And again, like I said last week, if you have any prayer needs, if you have somebody in your family or your friends or anything, definitely don't hesitate to send those to me. And again, if you're not comfortable sharing them publicly, that's cool. Send them to a private message either with me or with somebody at Tanglewood Church, and they'll be glad to reach out and pray with you. But if we don't have any more questions coming through, then I'll go ahead and pray, and we'll get out of here, and hopefully be back with you guys live as soon as we can. All right, let's pray. So Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for this technology. Father, I pray that you would be with each and every person that's watching now and each and every person that may be watching this later on. Father, I don't know who they are or what they need, but you do, Father. And we just pray that you would be with them in whatever it is that they're going through. Father, we pray that you'd be with anybody touched by this disease. And Father, we pray that you'd be with each and every medical worker and first responder out there. Father, I know that they're on the front lines and you have a plan for them. Father, we just pray that this would be used to glorify you in some way, and until we can meet again. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. Well, again, I look forward to seeing you in person as soon as we can. I hope y'all enjoyed this. Don't feel hesitate to send me some feedback or some questions or what a topic that you guys might like to see. Again, I don't know exactly who the audience is anymore. It's not like I have the 5 or 6 people in my little classroom that we usually have. So again, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay? Until we get together again, we'll see you next time.